Chapter 1. Next, I'm looking at slide 10, and it talks about communication is relational. And again, we kind of touched on this in the last video. But it mentions people skills are critical if you want to become a successful interpreter. And that's so true just because that's all we do is work with people. If you're not a people person, you really need to reconsider this profession. Just because we work with people all the time, it's what we do. My little sister, she's so funny. She can't stand working with people. And so for a long time she thought she might work in a morgue or do something. Now she works as a surgical technician because at least those people are under anesthesia. And so she doesn't really have to deal with them too much. And even in that job, she still has doctors and other people she has to deal with. Any job is going to have that. But we are a service industry, and so you just have to be aware of that and keep that in the back of your mind as you're interpreting, if you want to be successful at least. Message construction is what we're going to talk about next. It's on page 6 and page 7 of your book, and it kind of continues on past that. But on slide 11, you'll see that it says, you really need to know your speaker or your signer's goal, or what is their purpose, right? If I want to let you know that you are fat, okay, or that you've gained weight since the last time I've seen you, in English, I may say, wow, looks like life's been treating you well, maybe, I don't know. There are different ways that you could probably go about that, or, looks like you've been getting some love handles there. I don't know, different things like that. We may try to euphemize, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but different kinds of language that you may use in English. But their goal or their purpose in that is to say, it looks like you've gained some weight. So in sign language, you would probably need to be more direct and just say, fat you. I don't know. I mean, that's one way of talking about it. It's also important to know about status and power differentiation roles. You need to know who the players are and what the activity is that you're doing. So if you're doing a doctor's appointment, for example, okay, you really don't want to align yourself either with the doctor or with the patient. Or, for example, let's even go to something like a court case. Okay, if the defendant is the deaf person, I probably, even though in deaf culture it's very common to walk up and hug people, oh, I haven't seen you in so long, how are you doing? Yeah, you're probably not going to do that with the deaf defendant if you're interpreting for the court, because it just looks bad, right? Again, it's one of those perceived conflicts of interest, whether it is or not. And so anyway, you just kind of need to keep that in check. You never want to align yourself with the deaf person, and you don't want to align yourself with the hearing person either, because now to that deaf person it looks like, great, hearing oppression, there's 2 to 1, and that's kind of what it may be perceived as to them. So you definitely, and I don't even care who's paying me, I don't care where the money is coming from, I'm still going to be fair and just, and I'm not going to align myself with either person. So it's just something to keep in the back of your mind. Also, where is the event happening? Is it a public or a private kind of venue? Where is it that you're interpreting? Because a lot of that's going to influence what kind of language you use and where you're going to stand, where you're going to sit, what's more appropriate, those kinds of things. And so it's important to know what is the goal of that environment. Let's see. Also, know your speaker's goal. I do video relays sometimes, and of course you get a lot of, just calls of people wanting just like sales calls and those types of things. And the goal of that person is to be persuasive, to really convince the other person, to hook them, to make sure that they get that person to buy their product. And so even though I may not believe in their product, I have to be just as convincing in sign language or back in English, dependent upon who the person is that's selling the product. And I have to sound as pro that product as they are. And so sometimes that's very difficult, especially if you really do have strong feelings one way or another about something. It can be very, very difficult. Or when you know someone's getting ripped off, it's really hard. It's very, very difficult. But again, I have to know, what is that speaker's goal? Are they trying to trick the person? This is one reason I don't do court. I do not interpret in court because I know that the attorney's goal is to try to ensnare or to trap that person in their statements, and there's not always, again, a one-to-one ratio in English versus sign language. So, for example, if the way I may interpret things sometimes may be considered leading the witness, which wouldn't really be fair. In sign language, or in for example, I guess, the attorney may say, well, what weapon did that person use? Well, in sign language, there's not a sign for weapon. You have to do an expansion technique to explain different types, maybe listing of weapons. But in doing that, I may be placing thoughts into the witness's head, and so, I don't know, it gets very, very sticky, and so, henceforth, I don't do legal interpreting. If you have questions about that, you need to talk to a legal interpreter, but that is not me. So you can see language and communication is obviously very important, and when we start to do this message construction, as it talks about in slide 11, it's difficult. You really do have to know the purpose of what the person is trying to convey. On slide 12, we talk about implied versus overt language. One of those things is, and it talks about this even in your book, is in sign language, we, again, are more specific than usually we are in English. And so if a person says, I'm going to go powder my nose, dude, they're not going to go powder their nose, they're going to take a crap, okay? Let's just be real. That's what they're going to do, okay? Or to go pee or something. But in English, you don't do that. But the implied idea is they're going to the bathroom. And so in English, maybe the person says they're going to powder their nose. I'm probably going to look at the deaf person and say, bathroom them. That's probably what I'm going to do. Or vice versa. If the deaf person says, I'm going to go take a crap, bathroom me, or me, whatever, poop me, I'm probably going to look at the hearing person and say, I need to use the restroom, or something that's a little bit more euphemistic than what the deaf person probably just said, because it's more appropriate culturally. That's called cultural equivalence, or dynamic equivalence is sometimes how we refer to that, cultural mediation, where we try to make an equivalent message in the opposite language, because their intent was not to offend that person. And if I say, dude, I'm going to go take a crap, it may offend the hearing person, which was not the deaf person's intent. So you really do have to know what's their intent behind what they're saying. Let's see. The degree of directness, it talks a lot about this in your chapter, and your CD-ROM or your DVD that comes with your book has great examples of all of these things, and so I highly recommend that you utilize that as a tool. But for example, euphemistic language, I've given you examples of that. We just really are much more euphemistic in English than they are in sign language. They're just so much more direct. I just gave you some examples of abstract language as well. We use abstract concepts all the time in English, whereas in sign language you need to be much more specific about what you're talking about. If I say jewelry in English, in sign language there's not really a good equivalent to that. You have to explain necklace, earrings, bracelet, whatever, and anyway, it becomes much more difficult. Again, it's not a one-to-one ratio. And that's true of any language interpretation, not just English to sign language or sign language to English. Passive voice, this one is really difficult because in English we use this all the time to be vague. The president was shot. Well, if I just do this, it looks like either the president shot himself or, there's just really no way to talk about that. I need to know who shot the president, really. It's hard to be vague, like someone came and shot the president. Don't know who that person is. It's very difficult to convey that in sign language, and yet we use that all the time in English. And so it's good to be aware of that. You'll hear that a lot in news reports, newspapers, those types of things.